Hello and welcome back to Nature in Code. We're still in chapter 2. We're implementing Hardy-Weinberg in JavaScript, and in the last lecture we actually finished our implementation. We implemented it in JavaScript and things seem to be working just as we wanted them to. However, in the last lecture we mentioned something that we considered really bad practice, and that was the following. If you look at this code, there's a lot of duplication in this code, right? So these lines here are repeated over and over again, and they're exactly identical. And that's of course because we simply copied these lines up here and then we pasted them a couple of times further down in the code. And we mentioned that this was considered bad practice. And just to repeat, it's considered bad practice because you are now not dry anymore. And DRY stands for don't repeat yourself. Your code is not dry anymore. In fact, you have the exact same code copied multiple times throughout your code. So these lines here are here multiple times. That's bad because, imagine you'd like to change that calculation, or maybe later, you find a mistake in the calculation. So now you have to go and change this 5 times rather than just once. So make sure you encapsulate parts of your code that you want to execute multiple times into so-called functions. And that's a real core idea in programming, to encapsulate functionality within a function. And then later on, you can just call this function and that code gets executed. So what would this look like? So let's say I would like to take this code, and this is the one that I copy pasted here a couple of times, and I would like to implement a function that encapsulated this code. So in JavaScript, it's actually quite easy to do. You just use the word function, and that is a keyword, as you can see here from the syntax highlighting. And then you have to define a name for your function. And again, just like variable names, they follow the same rules, and make sure you use names that are meaningful. So I'm just going to call this create next generation. And then every function has these parentheses, and the parentheses contain the arguments that you would like to be able to be passed on to a function. So in this case, we're not going to define any arguments for this function, and so these parentheses are empty. And now in curly brackets, you will have the function body. So the function body is this code here, and I'm just going to copy paste that over here. And so now we have encapsulated this code here into a function, and that function is called create next generation. And now the nice thing is we can just get rid of this here and instead simply call create next generation. Simply call the function like this. So we got rid of it here as well. Okay. Oops, I should be careful here. Generation. Okay. Generation. All right. And now I can basically get rid of this. I can replace these lines with this function call. Make sure this looks nice here. So I hope you see what's going on here, and that you get the point. So now I'm basically calling this function 5 times here and here and here and here and here, and every time I'm calling this function, the execution of the code jumps to the function definition. It looks for the function, it finds it, and it executes this code. And now this is great because later if you decide that you would like to change anything in this particular code, you can just change it here in the function definition, and whenever you call that function, your code will execute correctly. And so this is quite important. And essentially, when you look at JavaScript code, you'll find that most of it is basically just the definition of functions and the call of these functions. Programs are to 95% basically structured into functions. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it. And I hope to have given you a good example here. I'd like to say just a few words about this function name. So again, please, in the interest of your future self and in the interest of others who might work with this code, be sure to name the function in a way that it's easy to understand what this function does by just looking at the name. And the other thing here is the notation that I would like to highlight. So I call this function create next generation. I could have written it like this, but this is pretty bad, right? Because it's kind of hard to read, don't you think? Create next generation. It's much easier to read if you separate words with this underscore. So now it's much easier to read. However, in the JavaScript community, you often find this type of notation, which is called camel case notation. So every word except the first one begins with a capital letter, and that also makes it a little easier to read. However, I generally prefer this notation. I think that's actually even easier to read. I should also note that we are accessing variables here, A1, A1, and so on, P and Q, that we have defined above. And we will talk about this in another lecture, but just realize that you can access variables that have been defined somewhere else in a function. That's perfectly fine. All right, so these are functions, and functions are very handy, and you'll use them all the time, and it will define many functions throughout this course. So make sure you understand how they work, but fundamentally they're quite simple. When you define a function, just say function, give it a name, add the parentheses, add any arguments that you would like to receive here, or none if you'd like to receive no arguments, and then within curly brackets define what your function should do. And then whenever you want to call that function, simply call the function by its name, and pass on any parameters here that you would like, or none. All right, so that's it. So in the next lecture, we are going to fix this even further, or I should maybe say improve it, because the code is working. Actually, let's save it and reload it in the browser over here. Let me reload the code. Yep, still the exact same outcome here. So the code is working. It doesn't need any fixing per se. However, we're still doing something here that you might find a bit strange. I mean, I just said, don't repeat yourself, don't copy code, and then you saw me copying this function call 5 times. So that's a little inconsistent. So actually, I'm going to introduce in the next lecture another fundamentally important principle. I would argue, in fact, that it's even more important than functions, and that's the idea or the principle of iteration. And we'll talk about this in a second in the next video. So I'll see you in the next video.